looked at historical stock returns and volatility in our last lesson. In this lecture, we'll explore risk, expected returns, and the concept of diversification to answer an investment advisor's favorite question. Do you want to eat well, or do you want to sleep well? What in the world does that mean? Let me illustrate by offering to play two coin flipping games with you. They're the same except for the prizes. To keep your attention, I'm going to charge you to play these games. We'll talk about how much you have to pay in a moment. In the first game, I flip a coin one time. Heads, you get $1,000. Tails, you get $1,000. That's right, you get $1,000 no matter what. That may be boring, but another name for boring is safe. In the second game, I flip the same coin one time, just like in the first game, but this time the payoffs are different. Heads, you get $2,000. Tails, you get nothing. Because half the time you get $2,000 and half the time you get nothing, your expected payoff, if you play a few times, is the same $1,000 per clip as it is in the first game. Each individual time you play, though, you either double your money or get nothing and lose the amount you paid to play. That's not boring. That's really risky. So, how much will you pay to play these games? It depends on whether you like to eat well or sleep well. If you're like most people, then you'd pay as much as $1,000 to play the safe game. At the cost of $1,000, you get all of your money back immediately. It's perfectly safe. The second game, though, is anything but safe. On average, half of the time you win $1,000 and half of the time you lose $1,000. If you're like most people, then you won't pay as much to play this game. You'll discount your bid because you don't like that uncertain payoff. You might pay, let's say, $800 for a very risky expected payoff of $1,000, but you won't pay the full $1,000. If you're willing to pay $800 but not a dime more, then you're saying that an expected profit of $200 is just enough to entice you to take the risk. We've just illustrated one of the most important traits of financial markets. You can play safe, or you can try for big returns. Sure, you can take something in between, but you can't have both safety and big returns. That's because competition won't let you have both. Suppose that you decided to lower your bid for the first game to just $900, thus guaranteeing yourself a $100 profit after you collect your winnings of $1,000. That would be a great deal, wouldn't it? I see two problems with that strategy, though. First, although it's a great deal for you, I am absolutely not taking your new lower offer. Why would I play if I'm guaranteed to lose $100? The second reason your strategy won't work is that even if I have to play the game, I don't have to play it with you. If I offer to play with a couple dozen people, then somebody's going to offer me right around $1,000 for that guaranteed $1,000 payoff. Competition will protect me from having to take a bad deal. We need to make a very important distinction when we think about risk. There's a difference between a bad deal and a good deal that turned out badly. We don't always get what we expect, do we? Let's return to that risky coin flip. And this time, we'll invite your friend Lisa to play too. I'll play you first, then I'll play Lisa. Let's say that you and Lisa both agree to pay $800 for the game that pays $2,000 for heads and nothing for tails. That's important. Both you and Lisa have exactly the same deals. You see where we're going with this, don't you? If you both have exactly the same deals, then setting aside issues like whether she likes to gamble and you don't, this can't be a bad deal for one of you and a good deal for the other one. It's the same deal. You know what's coming next. One of you is going to lose the game and one of you is going to win. I'll let you choose which of you wins. I think I'll be right more often than not if I assume that you'll decide that your coin flip lands heads so that you win the $2,000 prize and Lisa's coin flip lands tails, so she gets nothing. You have a $1,200 profit on your risky gamble of $800. Lisa has an $800 loss on hers. I'll bet you're a lot happier than she is. But we'd be wrong to say that you made a good deal and Lisa made a bad one. Remember, you both had exactly the same deal. The difference is that your deal turned out well and Lisa's turned out badly. For the rest of this course, we need to remember that good deals sometimes go bad, but that didn't make it a bad deal when you made it. You can get lucky on a bad deal too, but that doesn't mean you had a good deal. Maybe you just beat the odds and got lucky. We can't be sure whether or not you both had good deals before the flip. Most of the time, we can't tell for sure whether you had a good deal or a bad deal on risky choices like buying stocks. We can turn to our understanding of how markets work to make some reasonable conclusions, such as, at least most of the time, stocks are fairly priced. They aren't good deals or bad deals. But we really don't know for sure. Part of the reason we can't tell if a stock is a good buy or not is that we never get to see exactly what the market expects. It was hard enough to tell if a price like $800 is fair with a coin flip, even when we knew the odds were 50-50 and the payoffs were either exactly $2,000 or exactly zero. With stocks, we don't know the odds, we don't know the payoffs, and we don't even know when those payoffs will occur. We don't even know the consensus for the market's estimates of these numbers. Identifying good deals is really hard if it's possible at all. Sometimes we can get some respectable estimates, sure, but if someone claims to know what the market expects, then he's either arrogant or naive, or both, I suppose. Because we never get to see the market's expectations, we never get to see the true risk of a stock either. For that matter, not everyone agrees on the right measure of risk. Market participants do seem to have settled on a reasonable estimate of how much extra they expect stocks to return than some really safe asset, such as a U.S. government security or what you would earn in an insured bank account. We call this the equity risk premium. Let's take a closer look. First, we have to realize that we never get to see the equity risk premium. We can only estimate it. Getting half of what we need is easy. We can get a great estimate of the return on a really safe asset just by looking at the rate on the internet or by calling a broker. The problem is getting an estimate of the expected return on the stock market itself. There's no really good way to estimate the expected return on the market, but there are a couple of pretty good ways. Let's construct our own estimate of the equity risk premium now. For those of you who like math, the figures I'm about to discuss are geometric averages. They give us a better feel for what you'd actually have earned. Let's start with a nice, long time period. We'll use annual information from 1928 to 2011. Stock returned a nominal annual rate of 9.23%. The safest possible investment, Treasury bills, returned 3.61% over the same period. The difference between the two is 5.62%. Remember, these are the values that actually appeared, not necessarily the values people expected. The stock returns and the risk premium that we compute using them give us an estimate of what we want to know, not exactly what we want to know. And although they are among the best estimates we can find, that still doesn't mean they're good estimates. We're trying to solve a tough problem here. But if the stock returns that actually showed up from 1928 to 2011 are close to what investors really did expect at the time, then the equity risk premium was 5.62%. Let's suppose that we got lucky and that our estimate is exactly right. That would mean that collectively, investors in 1928 actually expected stocks to return 5.62% more than a safe asset. What does an equity risk premium of 5.62% tell us? It doesn't tell us what you'll get if you invest in the stock market today. It tells us that if the same circumstances hold today as held in 1928, then the stock market consensus is that stocks ought to return 5.62% more than safe investments over the next period. If in fact we do get what we expect, then we'll earn that 5.62% plus whatever a safe asset pays over the next period. That's a lot of ifs, and they're big ifs too. We're trying to get a handle on a very difficult problem. Yogi Berra told us that it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. But we have a better idea of what to expect now than before we calculated our estimate. Before we move on, let's get a couple more estimates to help us understand the equity risk premium. Some people might argue that we're using the wrong safe asset. True, Treasury bills are safe, but they are also very short maturity. The ones we used mature in just 3 months. We're matching those 3-month securities with stock returns over more than 80 years. You can make the case that we should match long-term government bonds to these stock returns. There aren't any 80-year U.S. Treasuries, but the 10-year bond rate is easy to find. That's still a long way from 80 years, but it's 40 times longer than 3 months. Does that change our estimate of the equity risk premium? The answer is yes, and by quite a bit. Treasury bonds returned 5.14% over the period compared to the 3.61% you would have gotten on Treasury bills. If we use the bond return in our calculation, then we get an estimated equity risk premium of just 4.10% instead of the 5.62% we got using Treasury bills. That's over 1.5 percentage points less. Does that change your feelings about how much you want to invest in stocks? Only you can decide, and it's good to have this information when you do. Some people might argue that the world is so much different from the way it was in 1928 that getting an estimate from then just doesn't make sense. Whatever was true about the equity risk premium then isn't true now, they say. They may have a point. If you want an estimate of your weight, then it might make sense to weigh yourself a couple of times to allow for normal variation. You'd get a better estimate that way. It might make sense to weigh yourself every day for a week or maybe even a month. But if you were born in 1970, you wouldn't want to factor in how much you weighed back then. You'd be pulling the average way down by including your birth weight. A lot has changed since then. If we decide to ignore data before 1962, we'd find that stocks returned about the same as they did over the longer sample, while government securities returned more. That should lower the estimate of the equity risk premium because it's the difference between the two. Sure enough, it does. Compared to short-term Treasury bills, the equity risk premium is 4.02%, and compared to 10-year bonds, it's only 2.35%. I'm going to give you one more estimate just to show that this is really, really a hard problem, and we don't know nearly as much as we'd like. If you were to say, I'm only going to consider returns after 2002, then you'd be in for a surprise. Stocks returned just under 2.9% during the next 10 years. That beat Treasury bills, but Treasury bonds returned almost 6.5%. The estimate of the equity risk premium is a negative 3.6%. What's that mean, you say? Are you telling me that investors in 2002 expected to do worse in risky stocks than in safe bonds? Why would they take extra risk and still expect to do worse in the bargain? And you'd be right. If they really had expected that, then they'd have chosen the safer bonds and expected to get higher returns anyway. What we're seeing is that this particular estimate of the equity risk premium is a particularly bad one. I can't believe that investors were expecting to earn nominal returns of less than 2.9% annually for 10 years or so. I'm betting that it just turned out to be a bad 10 years for stocks. We don't always get what we expect, after all. We encounter a particularly vexing problem when we use historical data to make financial decisions. It's called the black swan problem. That's a rather elegant way to alert us to the realization that just because an event hasn't happened, that doesn't mean that it will never happen. Until the late 17th century, Europeans had never seen a black swan, and people disagreed about whether they existed or not. Some people claimed that if they did exist, then they would have seen one by then. Turns out they were wrong. In fact, black swans were rather common in Western Australia. So, if I showed you a distribution of Dow Jones stock returns over about an 80-year period, you'd see more or less a normal distribution. With most of the annual returns for the year piling up between 10 and 30%, you'd see that the worst annual return would be really bad. You'd have lost about half of your investment in the worst year. But, you might say, that's only half of my investment, not all of it. If that's the worst the stock market can do to me, then I can handle that. If you say that, then you're making a mistake. That's not the worst that the stock market can do to you. It's the worst we've seen so far. True, we may never see a year that's worse than we've seen so far, but we might. Black swans do exist. Now let's turn to one of investing's most important concepts, diversification. I keep saying that there's no free lunch. In the investing world, though, diversification is pretty close. You already understand the basic idea because you've heard the adage, don't put all your eggs in one basket. The corresponding investment advice is, don't put all your money in one stock. Here's an example of diversification's benefits. Suppose that you have $2,000 to invest, and let's say that IBM and Coca-Cola Company are the only two companies in the world. You could put all of your money in IBM, all of it in Coca-Cola, or some in each. If you put all of it in IBM and it goes up 20%, then you have $2,400. Congratulations. If IBM declines by 20%, then you have just $1,600. Better luck next time. Or you could do the same with Coca-Cola, and you may or may not get the same result. Let's suppose that instead of putting all of your eggs in one basket, you diversify by putting $1,000 in each stock. If both IBM and Coca-Cola increase or decrease by 20%, then you haven't gained anything relative to plunging into one stock. But you haven't lost anything either. You'll have the same 20% increase or decrease either way. The benefits of diversification appear because IBM and Coca-Cola don't move together all the time. Sometimes IBM will increase while Coca-Cola will decrease. Your 20% gain on one offsets your loss on the other. Your good days won't be as good as if you put all your money into one stock, but your bad days won't be as bad either. We won't do the math, but you can prove that a portfolio of two assets doesn't cost you anything in terms of expected return compared to holding just one asset, and the returns will be less variable. That's pretty close to a free lunch. The gains from holding a well-diversified portfolio are dramatic. Just holding two different stocks instead of one decreases portfolio variation by about 25% on average, and holding three drops it about 40% on average. The gains get smaller as you add more stocks, and you'll capture most of the benefit by the time you're holding about 15 stocks. Your portfolio returns will vary only about half as much as if you held just one stock. That's an amazing reduction in risk. And remember, it doesn't cost you anything in terms of expected return. Your good days won't be as good, but your bad days won't be as bad either. On average, you'll get the same returns and eliminate some of the wild swings in value you'd otherwise face. No matter how many stocks you hold, though, you'll find you just can't reduce your portfolio returns variation to zero. You can't eliminate all risk. Even with 1,000 stocks, your portfolio returns will still vary about 40% as much as a single stock. That's because some sources of risk affect all stocks. A bad jobs report will hurt IBM, Coca-Cola, and just about every other stock imaginable. Economists call this kind of risk systematic risk because it's in the system. If you want to hold stocks, then you're going to take on systematic risk. The other kind of risk is unsystematic risk. That's the risk that's unique to a specific stock. If Coca-Cola lands the contract to supply soft drinks to Regal Cinemas, then that's good news for Coke shareholders, but it won't affect IBM. If IBM develops a better way to manage energy consumption for a manufacturer, then that's good for IBM shareholders in the manufacturer, but it won't sell any extra soft drinks. Diversification gets rid of the unsystematic risk because the events that affect just one or two companies are likely to be canceled out by events happening at other companies. If you hold a well-diversified portfolio, then you're holding just the systematic risk. You might think that companies in the same line of business tend to move together more than companies in different industries. You're right. Home Depot is closer to Lowe's than it is to Apple or ExxonMobil. If you're holding only two stocks, then you're better off pairing Home Depot with something other than another home improvement store. U.S. equities are only about a third of total world equities. Can diversification help? The answer is yes, but only to a point. Studies show that the benefits of international diversification won't insulate you from major financial crises. In particular, just about every reasonably good-sized stock market around the world suffered during the crashes of October 1987 and the last 4 months of 2008. This suggests that international diversification may not offer that much extra protection. One study found that one emerging market index was almost perfectly correlated with the S&P 500 index in the US. They moved almost in lockstep. That's the exception rather than the rule, but it does illustrate that getting international risk exposure doesn't necessarily increase your portfolio's diversification. Still, although the benefits from international diversification are often overstated, they are real. International investing does bring complications. You'll face exchange rate risk. If your foreign company earns Mexican pesos, for example, then you run the risk that those pesos won't buy many dollars when you collect them. You'll face political risk. Investors in Iran didn't have a happy time during the unrest that led to the exile of the Shah in January 1979, and the ascension of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela in 1999 was no fun for investors there either. International investors also face information problems tracing to different accounting procedures and regulations, plus restrictions on repatriating cash, getting the money back to the US. Despite these problems, you may want to invest in a foreign company, such as Banco Santander, the huge international bank based in Spain. We've seen that can be a hassle. One partial solution is to hold American Depository Receipts, or ADRs for short. A U.S. financial institution buys the shares, then issues claims against them. As far as Banco Santander is concerned, you're not an owner. The financial institution sponsoring the ADR program is the owner. Banco Santander pays the dividends to that institution, which sends them on to you, the ADR holder. These ADRs trade publicly on a U.S. stock exchange, and they're priced in U.S. dollars, so you can get in and out of ADRs quickly and easily. ADRs carry extra fees of a few cents per ADR annually to cover the sponsoring institution's costs. You can also get international risk exposure and diversification through international mutual funds and exchange-traded funds. We'll discuss these asset classes more in Lesson 13, so you might want to keep this in mind. Just about all of the major financial services providers offer at least one international fund. Let's return to how we began this lesson. We asked the investment advisor's favorite question: do you want to eat well, or do you want to sleep well? Only you know how well you want to eat compared to how well you want to sleep, and you'll probably find that your choice will change over time. People's risk tolerances vary a lot. I once had a somewhat older student, perhaps 30 years old, who complained that my class was boring. I guessed that he had worked for a while before enrolling, so I asked him what had he done before going to college. He said he flew F-18s off the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz. I had to agree that compared to landing a supersonic strike fighter on a moving ship in the middle of the ocean at dusk, my class was a little boring. I'd be willing to bet that that student's investment portfolio is a lot riskier than most of ours. We think he's crazy. He thinks we're boring. We can all have different portfolios, and all of them can be right for us. Our challenge is to decide what's right for us. There's no one way that's best to learn your risk preferences. Most investment advisory firms use a short survey that gives a snapshot of your profile. Northwestern Mutual's personal investor profile has about 10 questions, such as, what is your primary goal for these invested assets? You pick from 5 buckets ranging from preservation of principal to capital appreciation and growth. Each of those buckets has a point total associated with it, and at the end of the survey, you total your points and plug that value into one of 5 categories ranging from conservative to very aggressive. A good investment advisor understands that your financial position depends on more than just your investment portfolio. A high school teacher has more job security than most people, so he might be able to take more risks than the owner of a small business who earns about the same amount on average, but with much bigger swings from year to year, and the prospect of business failure looming right around the corner sometimes. Northwestern Mutual gets at this by asking you to choose whether your current and future income sources are very stable, very unstable, or somewhere in between. I like tools like that. Nobody says this is enough to get a good grip on your risk tolerance, but questions like these are a great place to start. Answer the questions a couple of different times because your answers will change. Try it in the morning. Try it on a lazy weekend. And try it when you can't sleep at night. Why? Because your answers will change with your state of mind. You'll be willing to take more risks when you're happy than you will be when you're feeling blue. Over the years, you'll probably find that your risk tolerances change. Younger people tend to have a longer investment horizon, and many decide to take more risks with their portfolio. They reason that that strategy gives them the highest expected return, and they want to pile up a lot of money if they can. They're willing to take the chance that stocks might tumble early because they'll be able to spend less and save a little more to make up for it. Older people with shorter investment horizons don't have that luxury. They tend to hold safer investments. Life cycle or age-based funds put this process on autopilot. The appeal of life cycle funds is that you don't need to monitor your investment as much. At predetermined times, the fund's managers change the investment mix for you. I'm never going to say you can make an investment and forget it, but a life cycle fund lets you take a step in that direction. Bequest motives can extend the time horizon. If you're 70 years old, then a life cycle fund might have almost all of your money invested in safe assets and almost nothing in stocks. But if you plan to leave something in your will for your 10-year-old grandchildren, then that could change things. I'm managing these assets for them, not for me, you say. And according to that same life cycle argument, they should be invested in stocks. Life cycle funds aren't for everybody. Personally, I don't want stuff happening to my investments automatically. I want to make those decisions when I want to make them, and not when a fund manager decides to make them for me. To me, deciding whether or not I'm happy with my investment mix every year or so isn't all that hard. If a life cycle fund sounds good to you, though, then give them a look. In this lecture, we learned that, yes, stocks are risky, but you can limit that risk and improve your odds of making money in the long run. In our next lesson, we'll learn what determines how much money you have at the end of your investment. It boils down to 3 key numbers, and we'll see that most people worry about the one they can't really control.